News Network. I'm your host, Amy Dash, joined by LawNewz trial analyst Deborah Blum. Thank you for being with me.
I'm so happy to be here with you.
Fascinating case, and today the emphasis was on the bloodstains and what they mean, the positioning, the spatter effects. How important will that be to this case, especially considering that Adam Matos' DNA has not been connected to the crime scene in a significant way. So the fact that we're analyzing all of these victims' bloodstains everywhere, how much, which hit the fan, blood hit the fan, or where it was in the bedroom, does that really even matter?
You know, I've thought about that myself. I do think that it's important for them to get out how horrific and gruesome this crime scene is or was. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why they're really going through this in such great detail. We heard law enforcement discuss how they use a special tool to uncover blood that actually couldn't be seen to the eye, and various other procedures that were utilized. So I think that the prosecution is painting a picture here of just how horrific this was.
How accurate do you think it is to actually reconstruct the crime scene by analyzing the patterns of blood? How accurate is that to what really happened?
Well, I forgot to answer your last question about the DNA. I'm also surprised that they haven't been able to link his DNA in a more significant way.
Yeah.
But I guess the issue becomes the fact that he was living in this house for a good period of time with this family. So it's not going to be surprising that his DNA was at the crime scene. What I would have liked to have seen, and I'm sure that the state would have liked to have had, is something linking him to the weapons that were used or his blood-spattered fingertips somewhere, where you could actually see that he had touched something and have that DNA so they could say, we have his DNA on this person's gun or that was used for the commission of the crime, and they don't have that here.
Yeah, because it seems they found the van with a shovel inside. There were bodily fluids inside. There was blood in the van, maggots in the van, but his DNA is not connected with any of those weapons? That just seems bizarre. Why would he leave the leftover residue from the victims, but then wouldn't be connected to holding even these tools?
Well, as we were talking about in the break, there's a lot of bizarre things going on here. He was living in this home for a period of days with these decomposing bodies.
Yeah.
And he was using the mother, her debit card to buy pizza. He was going out to the bar, and he was driving around in the death van. So those are very peculiar facts and circumstances. But if I was his defense attorney, I would certainly be hammering home the point. In this day and age, there's DNA everywhere. I see it in my cases. I have a lot of domestic violence cases where it's alleged that my client, the defendant, violated the order of protection, and the district attorney's office tries to use DNA evidence to prove that. So it's being used all of the time in basic criminal cases. Another thing that we had talked about is the fact that the police had responded to this home earlier in the morning. I am sure that the officers who responded and did not arrest Matos that morning are feeling horribly about this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the DNA and the fact that it's pretty absent in a significant way from the crime scene, do you think that's because maybe he didn't bleed himself, so they couldn't pick up the DNA traces? A lot of people don't understand how they actually detect and match the DNA. Can you go through that process?
I actually should be a lot better on being able to explain to you the DNA.
But you're not a forensic expert.
Well, it's not that. It is relevant because it does come up in my cases, and when it does, I have to brush up on it. I hope that none of my clients with DNA Matters are currently watching. The thing is, I've seen how they take a DNA swab. It's a very basic, simple test. It's on your cheek. So I don't know that they actually need blood to take the DNA sample. I think that they would just need your actual fingerprints to touch the item in question. So if I understand correctly, I am surprised that there's no DNA here, except they might say that there's no, maybe he used gloves. He probably most likely did. It does sound like he made a lot of efforts to clean up the crime scene. He was sweeping out the garage.
But yet there was so much blood everywhere. That's what I don't understand. It's almost like it was a half-hearted attempt at a cover-up, if he did it.
Yeah, well, it's possible that he was trying his best to cover it up. He just really did a terrible job. You know, he had called the victim, one of the victims, his ex-girlfriend, the mother of his child, multiple times the day of the incident. And
yeah,
then
so
all
you
of a
were
sudden,
saying that's very significant. So he calls about 200 times, you know, within a 24-hour period before she's allegedly killed, according to the timeline of the prosecutor. And then you said that's significant because all of a sudden he stops.
Right. I would fully argue, as the prosecution in this case, that he stopped calling because he's the one that killed her and he knew that she was dead. So, you know, I had this conversation the other day with Jesse Weber that there would have been so many better ways if he did do this for him to try to cover this up by calling and saying, I came home to get my son from the mother, and all of her and her family and her new boyfriend were gruesomely murdered. And he didn't do anything to try to cover this up except some
half-hearted attempt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what about the fact that he's hanging out with for days? I mean, the guy clearly loves pizza. He's ordering pizza to the house like all the time, but he's going out to pool hall and to bars with the next door neighbor. Then he gets arrested and he tells the police that he hasn't been to that house since before the night that they thought the murder occurred.
Right. Well,
What's with that? If you're going to have an alibi, shouldn't your alibi be away from the house?
Well, I do think that that's a very strong point for the prosecution, is that he lied to investigators and said he wasn't at the house, but there are a lot of things that are linking into the house, such as these pizza deliveries, and they're going to have people be able to testify, including the neighbor, to say, yes, I was spending time with him, or I saw him, and I also smelled a strong odor emanating from the home. So those are going to be damaging for the defense.
Yeah, and you know, it seems like he's making all of these calls, hundreds of calls. He's, according to the victim's 911 call, threatened her to kill her. And then around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he makes the last call. At 6 o'clock, her father goes out to borrow something from the neighbor, so we know nothing has happened between 3 and 6 o'clock, or the father would know because he's at the house and he's still alive. What do you think's going on between that 3 to 6 period where this guy is bombarding her with phone calls before, but then there's a quiet before the storm, and then all of a sudden everybody goes missing starting at 6 o'clock. The neighbor doesn't see the father again. No one can get in touch with the girlfriend, and then later on the mother comes home and she never exits the house. So what is happening from 3 to 6?
Well, I guess that was the calm before this awful, awful storm. You know,
But what do you think he could have been doing? I mean, does that
He could have been preparing, but I believe that the weapons were taken from the father of this family, and there were people in that house that day, so I don't think that he went to the cellar or wherever they were kept. Perhaps he was planning this. I'm not 100% sure of what the prosecution is going to say. I know that they gave a very detailed opening, which really hammered home on the point that he had threatened them earlier that day, and that there was a whole scene regarding that. So there are missing pieces here. It's not the perfect murder. It's not the perfect case. And as I was sitting here, you know, to have DNA evidence, you just need some saliva, blood.
Oh, you were looking it up over there?
Yes,
Okay.
Different bodily fluids would give you a DNA hit. So I actually think that becomes a lot stronger for the defense, who at this point really has not done very much. They haven't given their opening. They've done very little cross-examination. They're not objecting. You know, there were a few things as I've been sitting here listening to the testimony.
Where you would have objected.
Yes.
Yeah, like what?
Just in general today, there were some comments by the prosecutor that didn't need to be there. You know, I don't remember the specific statement, but he made like a generalization, or he made a comment about, oh, this is a good representation. The prosecutor can't say that. The witness can say this is a good representation. So there were a few times that there should have been objections. And, you know, different defense attorneys have different strategies. Some only object when it's really going to be damaging, but you have to do something.
Yeah, you have to stand up because you want to preserve those issues on appeal. And if you don't put something on the record, then you can't bring it up later, right? Because if you're not contesting it.
Correct. Unless you're going to do an ineffective assistance of counsel, by saying, amongst other things, that my defense attorney didn't object to anything. You know,
Right.
they are making.
But that's not intentional on the part of the lawyer. If I'm representing, I'm not doing nothing so that I can later, so that I'm giving my client a free pass later to challenge my representation.
Well, some people,
Have you heard of that?
I've heard of that, yes.
Really?
I mean, you hear so many different things. I don't think that's what's happening here. I do think that they're going to come on strong. I think, you know, in New York State, you give your opening statement at the beginning of the case. I haven't heard of reserving your opening statement. I'm sure there's some possible support for that. I've read the criminal handbook guide a million times. I haven't seen it. So every state is very different. This happens to be a state where it's not a mandatory arrest for domestic violence issues. In New York State, if the police were called to the home with a threat of death or any minimal, nominal threat, someone would have been arrested.
That's a bizarre fact because, like you said, they're investigating for about an hour and a half. Then they're called back later on because they think there's a new threat or a new assault, but turns out it was just Megan Brown's boyfriend calling them back to the house. And there's a discussion about whether they're going to prosecute or bring some sort of an aggravated assault charge, but then nothing happens. The guy comes back to the house, allegedly. The father's probably there. We don't know what time the murders took place, but listen, they were setting up for a party, a party that afternoon. So, you know, what happened with the party goers? That's what I'm wondering. I mean, apparently the father said he was going to set up for an afternoon party with Megan and her coworkers. Nobody ever shows up.
Well, the coworker testified about how Megan was scared of Matos, how she didn't go into work. They had gone out for drinks the evening before with Nicholas Leonard, the boyfriend that was also gruesomely murdered. So I really think here that there are just a lot of things pointing to the fact that Adam Matos did this, like the 911 call, the fact that the victim told her colleague that she was so afraid of him. These are going to be big hurdles for the defense to overcome.
Yeah, and you can see her there with her son, which is, it's a very sad to look because she's such a beautiful woman, and of course, terrible that her son, I guess the thought is that he was in the house the whole time.
Right. I mean, this child.
Where was the kid? Because they find Adam Matos in a motel near a bus terminal. He's inquired about when the next bus out of town is, which is suspicious in and of itself. And, you know, he's with his son, but there are days that pass. And where is the boy? He's going out for pizza, he's going to the bar. Like, who is taking care of this boy? The grandparents are dead, the mother is dead, and there's an odd smell coming from the house, and you have a baby there. Does anybody know what happened with this kid during that interim of those several days?
You know, of course, I'm sure that this was a very traumatic experience for this child, and I don't know if it's something that the child will ever be able to recover from.
Hopefully, he's young enough that he did not understand what was going on if he saw anything.
I feel like it's human nature, even if you're a very young child, to understand something as gruesome as this, even if you don't really understand the specifics of what happened.
Yeah.
You have to know, I mean, the shrieks, the sounds that must have been coming from the crime scene were, I'm sure, horrific.
Yeah.
The child was interviewed by law enforcement. He did say that daddy did it, daddy was the killer, things like that, but he's also highly autistic. So there's a question of how reliable his statements were. Most likely the child was safe and sound, aside from this gruesome crime scene, in the house. Not that I'm advocating people leaving their children unattended in the middle of the night, but most likely the father just went out with the friend. I don't know if there was a babysitter. It sounds like he loved this child very much.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like not a babysitter because he wouldn't even let the pizza delivery guy into the house.
Right. Or the people that bought the family's dogs.
Yeah, exactly. And that very fact that he's posting the family's belongings and their dogs for sale on Craigslist immediately after these people are presumed dead. How strong is that fact for the prosecution, would you say?
I just think that these are all, you know, as a defense attorney, you poke holes and you say reasonable doubt. And you do the opposite as the prosecution. You would say, we have all of these facts, you know, no, we're not able to give you DNA evidence, which is really a bit peculiar. You would think that over this time period that they would have been able to link hair to him with this shovel, where it's alleged he went out and bought a shovel that was found in the van, and he buried the family. You know,
Yeah.
I'm surprised that they weren't able to uncover any DNA from that scene. These are all very surprising facts. But
do you think it was just sloppy processing? Because that happens also. It's very expensive to test DNA, so sometimes they do limited samplings.
You know, I think in a case of this magnitude, most likely it just sometimes you don't have things the way you want them to be. Just as a defense attorney, I oftentimes find that the facts don't really work to my advantage. Sometimes the prosecution is going to face the same thing. I do think that this is a much stronger case than some of the other ones that we've seen covered. I do think a lot links Matos to this. I do think as defense attorneys could really go forward with this. Why isn't the DNA there? You know, there's a history of other individuals that were obsessed with Nicholas Leonard and the mother of his child. So I do think that they have somewhere to go, and there were some phone calls that have been brought into question or will be brought into question. So they're going to say that's reasonable doubt, but the prosecution's going to say, okay, we don't have DNA, but we have all of these other things.
But how can they overcome this phone call where Megan is crying and saying that he's got a knife to her throat, trying to kill her hours before the crime allegedly happens? How do they overcome that?
You know, I don't know that they can, really. I think that that's going to be one of the things that's the linchpin here. As a defense attorney, I would have vehemently objected to that testimony coming in. I just think that it's highly prejudicial. Oftentimes, 911 calls are kept out, especially if it's not that exact incident.
But
although
why
that's
would a
not
threat
always
to kill someone not be relevant to this case when
Because
they're found
he's
dead
not-
hours later?
He's not charged with a threat to kill someone. He's only charged with this specific criminal incident. So you're not supposed to bring in uncharged acts. And he was not charged in that act. But, you know, of course, oftentimes they do come in, as we see here. And I don't think his defense really tried to object to the whole 911 tape coming in. I know that parts were stricken and the jury isn't going to be able to listen to them, but
The parts that referenced his ethnic background.
why does that even matter? If she's saying his name, I don't understand why that's so, you know, the thing that you're going to fight over. It's possible that they thought about the whole thing coming in. I was not watching at that time. I'm not sure if it was recorded. I just know that this 911 tape is very damaging.
Yeah, and so could that be grounds for appeal? The fact that this was allowed in, and like you're saying, it evidences an uncharged act?
You know, I don't think that alone would be grounds for an appeal. It's certainly something, if you were to file one, that you would list in your multiple areas that you put in. I think that there was one juror discharged from this case already. So those are the types of things that you would be covering in your appeal.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that any one charge count of murder is stronger than another one? For example, the fact that Megan Brown, that there was this 911 call, she says that he was threatening to kill her. Does that make the case on that count stronger than the case on the parents' count? Or is the fact that they are all found dead in the same home really put them on an equal playing field?
I think the latter. I think the fact that this family was found together, all buried together, it seems like one person is responsible for it. All signs are pointing...
Yeah, I'm sorry, they were found a mile from the crime scene along the highway. But they all lived together. So.
Right, they all lived together, they were all found together. That points to one person being responsible for the entire crime.
So then can you take any of the strong circumstantial evidence that just pertains to one person, like the 911 call, and does it, you know, in your mind transfer to everybody to support that entire case, even though they're separate counts? Is that how it works, and is that legally how it's supposed to work?
Well, it's there's circumstantial evidence, as you just said, and legally, you know, things have rules and applications, but a lot of this is just logic. So if the jury believes that the pizza man came and smelled decomposing bodies, and that Adam Matos came to the door and paid for it and wouldn't let them in, if they believe that he went and purchased the shovel, which I believe there's proof of. It's not just circumstantial. There's going to be direct proof that he purchased it and it was found in the van near the crime scene. All of those things are going to be what the prosecution argues, and they're going to say he used that shovel to bury all four of those bodies, not just one.
So this is kind of a case of like, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. That's really the prosecution's argument here, is you've got somebody threatening to kill someone buying a shovel, trying to flee town days later, not letting people into the house, remaining in the house where there's blood discovered, and all of the forensic evidence points to the fact that that blood was not fresh, and he hadn't just arrived on the scene, but had been there living and coexisting with this bloody crime scene. That, you know, take it for what it is. That's going to be their case. On the flip side, you said that the defense should bolster their argument about there not being any direct DNA. But if you're sitting there as a juror and you have this strong circumstantial case versus a weaker forensic case, what is more persuasive, would you say?
You know,
is it 50-50?
as a defense attorney, I hate to say this, it's definitely not 50-50. I think that the chips are definitely stacked in the favor of the prosecution. I think that they have enough that they're going to say, okay, and we wish we could. Heard all of these individuals testify. You heard about the fear that Megan Brown had for Adam Matos. You heard the 911 call. You listened to that yourself. You heard from all these individuals that smelled the decaying bodies. You have neighbors who observed him in very peculiar states, sweating, looking wet, you know, not like a normal person just going outside to get the newspaper, wearing a bath. That type of, the way he was observed, that would be linked to somebody that was trying to cover up a murder.
Despite him lying and saying that he hadn't been at the house in days, do you think that the fact that he was at the house, that he was in the bathroom, that he was talking to the neighbor, going out, getting pizza deliveries, that could help him in any way? Because nobody in their right mind would think that someone would kill 3 people and then remain in the house for days later, even though people outside the house could say that it smelled like decomposing bodies. I mean, would that help him, or do you think that the jury would just logically conclude that there's something severely wrong with him, that he would kill someone and stay at the house? It makes it like another layer of a psychopathy.
You know, I don't know why people do these horrible things, whether it's him or somebody else. There's no reason to take another person's life, let alone 4 people's lives. So I can't speak to the pathology behind this. Obviously, if it was him, there's something severely wrong with him, that he stayed in the home for all of that time. He exposed his young son to all of this. Those are really just heinous things that words can't describe how awful that is. So I think that it's assumed that if he was the one that did this, that there's something incredibly off about him. His defense attorney did not elect to use a mental defect defense. Now, oftentimes that's not successful. We covered the Slender Man trial here, and it was a success in that case, but that is very rare, because there are so many things that go into a mental defect defense. You have to have experts come in and testify. You have to have typically the person be on medication, and just a lot of protocol. And jurors will often believe, yeah, that person has a mental defect, but I'm not going to excuse their criminal behavior due to it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the major drawbacks of that defense, is that even if somebody thinks that someone does meet the legal standard, because we know that's different from the manual standard that psychologists use, a lot of times they still don't want to find that they met the standard, even if they think they did, because like you said, they don't want to let them off.
Right. Well, I think it's a very interesting area of the law. Oftentimes people that do suffer from mental illness don't treat it. And it's not until something terrible occurs and they're in the criminal justice system where it's suggested that they go for a psychiatric evaluation, where they begin to see a therapist. You know, people always say, how do you do your job? And they view it as very black and white. But as a defense attorney, you're often able to help your client. And if they have this terrible mental health issue, you're the one that's advocating for them to get help. So, and that's also preventing future crime, because you're mitigating the chances that they're going to reoffend.
Yeah, exactly. You know what, I want to talk more about this, but let's toss to a clip from earlier this morning with the Bloodstain analyst, Anna Cox, where she talks about how they're using the pattern of the blood, the color of the blood, the saturation of the blood, and the positioning of different blood stains to essentially reconstruct the crime, because what happened in that house is still largely a mystery.
All right, Ms. Cox, I'd like to talk about blood stain pattern analysis, okay? Generally, what is blood stain pattern analysis?
It's the scientific study of the blood stains and patterns that result from a blood shedding event. And any event where blood is shed, it can be analyzed based on the dynamics of the blood and its distribution. We identify, we document, we analyze, and we define bloodstains and patterns based on a multiple of different characteristics. We look at their size, we look at their shape, we look at their overall distribution, we take in consideration the number of the stains that there are, but then we also have to take into consideration the locations of the stain, the surface it's on, the relationship of other stains at the scene, the scene-specific variables, and what I mean by that is if there's medical intervention, if there's any type of scene alteration, if the victim has been transported and is no longer at the scene. So we have to take in consideration stains that might be caused by those types of events. And then we also have to have just a history of the scene and the evidence, and that basically comes into play when I read the crime scene technician reports and their description of where items of evidence were, what their condition when they were collected, whether they were wet, whether they were folded, whether they were in a different location. So the history also allows me to focus on stains that are relevant to the actual bloodshedding event itself.
And is there a purpose to the work that you do?
The purpose is to attempt to do an overall reconstruction. Sometimes we are able to do a very detailed reconstruction, sometimes we are not. But most of the time we can tell you where victims were located when the bloodshedding event occurred. We can also tell you at times where a potential suspect or a witness to the event may have been located. We can sequence some of the patterns in the scene. So basically what that means is I will have one type of pattern and then something will come through and alter that pattern, and I'll be able to tell that. Also movement of a person that has blood on their person or on an item, if those are moved around the residence and are in locations that are separate than where the actual trauma occurred, we can assess where individuals went, what they touched. And it's also a lot of times used as an investigative tool to confirm or refute statements that are made during the course of the investigation.
And the scientific basis for bloodstain pattern analysis, if you could describe that for the jury?
Bloodstain analysis, we call it BPA, really embraces the natural sciences. And the reason is because we, as analysts, are required and it's necessary for us to understand the natural sciences and how they play a role in bloodshedding events. The first would be biology, components of blood. The reason I understand components of blood is because later in the investigation I'm going to be using some chemical enhancement, and I have to understand what part of the blood I'm trying to enhance, why, and there's specific reasons why we choose different chemicals. Changes in appearance due to decomposition outside of the body. Sometimes decomposition can cause blood to turn, like in Florida, it can sometimes turn black. In colder environments, sometimes it turns orange. So if you're not aware of that, you might interpret stains that should have been included that were not. Also, we have to understand the reaction of a body to the infliction of an injury. And what I mean by that is, for example, an injury to an artery will produce different blood stains than a breach to a vein. And that's because they have a different purpose inside of your body. Also, capillaries bleed differently. We also have to understand where location of injury, internal bleeding, if we have any external factors like clothing or anything like that that might affect the body's reaction to the infliction of the injury. Physics. The thing about bloodstain analysis is it's just the blood is distributed how it's distributed at that moment. So if there's an impact or blood is struck with a force, it's going to react differently than if something just drips off of the end of this particular pointer. So, and that is due to cohesion and surface tension. We also have to understand the viscosity, and what basically viscosity is resistance to flow. And the best way for me to explain that is take maple syrup. And if you have maple syrup and it's in the refrigerator, it's very cold. And when you take it out, it's very difficult to pour. It's because it's viscous. It's got a lot of viscosity at that point. You introduce heat to it, you start to break up that viscosity, and then what happens to your maple syrup? It pours easier on your pancakes. So that's what viscosity is. Same thing for blood. If it's got another liquid that's introduced to it or different temperatures, it is going to react differently. Gravity and air resistance, which is a natural occurring phenomenon. Eventually, gravity, if allowed, can break the natural phenomenon of surface tension. And the introduction of outside forces and the effect that it will have on a particular blood stain. There are a variety of forces that can be introduced to a blood stain. And we need to be aware of what those different introductions, such as gunshots or somebody getting kicked, those types of forces are completely different on the realm of how intense they are. So they produce different sized stains. Mathematics, when we attempt to locate the exact area of origin of where we believe an individual or a source of blood exactly was when it was impacted, we have to use trigonometry. It's based on the Pythagorean theorem, and it requires that we do a trigonomic type of mathematics. Chemistry, this goes back to understanding your components of blood. We have products that we use to enhance protein in your blood. A lot of those are used unseen because they're very easy to use and they're very effective. Or depending if you have more of a dynamic or a more damaged scenario with your blood, you might go for something a little more sensitive. That would be your heme product, and that reacts with the hemoglobin in your blood. So when we use these chemistries, we have to understand why we're using them. And the other thing is it's necessary for us to test the blood to make sure that it is in fact blood, because I don't want to be doing an analysis on ketchup. I would rather do analysis on blood. And then we have the enhancement techniques.
In identifying bloodstains and bloodstain patterns, are there differences that you can talk about between the difference of stains? Can you talk about that?
Yes. Stains are basically categorized, and the best way for me to approach it is like trees in a forest. And a lot of our stains have a fundamental tree trunk. And then from that tree trunk, we have our branches. So when I say something like a passive drip stain, that is the trunk. One of the branches of that tree trunk would in fact be something called a passive drip stain. And a passive drip stain is just that. You injure your finger and you're standing there over the sink trying to render aid, and it's dripping down into the sink. That is a passive event. You're not inflicting any more force onto it, it's just dripping. Another branch would be what we call large volume stains. It's where a source of blood is just allowed to drip freely, and it will just flow with the natural topography of the floor or the substance that it is absorbed into. That's also passive, because you're not introducing any force to that. Then you also have another tree trunk, which are our transfer and our swipe stains. Now these have a minimal amount of force behind them, but not the kind of force that we use when we talk about spatter. Transfer is just that. If I have blood on my hands and I touch this counter, I will transfer blood from my hand to this counter if I have enough blood on my hand to do so, and if the blood is in fact wet. Also, along with the transfer is something called a swipe. And what a swipe basically is I have blood on an item or my hand, and I touch something and I move it. Basically, that is a swipe. So it's the introduction of me transferring blood, but also showing movement when I do it. Another complete different tree trunk is something called spatter. And that is caused by an external energy that disrupts the natural physics of surface tension and cohesion. So it is the introduction of an outside force. Gunshots, machinery accidents, explosions, stabbings, beatings, stompings. If you have a pool of blood on the floor and you drop something into it, those are all considered to be spatter events. Then we also have something called cast off, which is just like it sounds. It's blood drops that are released from a bloody item that is basically being flown. So if you have blood on the end of this pointer and you fling it back, blood will accumulate on the tip and eventually come back. And sometimes you can have corresponding cast-off patterns, which means if you have enough blood volume, you have blood that travels back and forward. So sometimes we get some distinct directionality in those cast-offs. Then we have another tree trunk, which would be altered stains. And the altered stains are typically pretty easy to identify because, as I stated earlier, blood is dispersed in millimeters of seconds. I don't even know the mathematical equation for it. So once it's dispersed, that's there's one way it happened. So when you start to go in and add liquids, it's going to look diluted. Skeletonization occurs when a drain or a stain starts to dries from the outside in. So the outside starts to dry, and then the inside either becomes cracked or something comes in and removes part of the stain. So you have the peripheral edges around it, it's skeletonized. A void is where you have a continuous pattern of blood and then there's no blood at all, where blood should logically be. And what voids tell us is one of two things: that something was there in that area when the bloodshedding event occurred and has since been removed, or if there's a continuous blood pattern and something without blood is on top of it, that would be in addition to the scene. And then we would ask ourselves, why was there an addition? And then we have a wipe, and sometimes wipe and swipe gets confusing. A wipe is where a stain pre-exists on a surface and something comes through and disrupts it after it's already on the surface. So that's the difference between a swipe and a wipe.
Okay. I'd like to get into some case-specific examples, and just so that we're clear, we're going to see a number of photographs that are going to be shown. The photographs of which we're going to discuss are not photographs related to the case work you did in this case. Is that correct?
Correct, they are not.
They are just examples of the things that which we're going to talk about.
Correct.
All right. It says here a passive drip stain. Could you describe this for the jury?
These are all considered passive drip stains, and they all look different. Well, the reason that they look different is because they're either all on a different surface or their directionality is different. So this particular passive drip stain over here on the top right-hand side would be is on like glass or marble. It's a very, very non-porous surface. It's very sheen. It's very clean, and it accepts the blood drop very nicely. Over here, this is also a passive drip stain, but this is on a mild piece of cardboard. So we have to take into consideration that when the blood actually was deposited on that, it was broken up a little bit by the coarseness of the cardboard. So concrete, we see concrete will do that, raw wood will break things up. So anything that has any type of porous nature or coarseness to it can alter the stain, but they're still considered to be passive. This is also a passive drip stain down here in the bottom. The difference is it's on a vertical surface as opposed to a horizontal. So this stain right here could have very easily been deposited if I had blood on my hands and I put my hands here, it could very easily, and that's still a passive stain, it's just on a different surface. And then this is considered passive drip trail. And you can see we have what we call a little bit of scalloped edges. And that's just because that's on like a piece of tile that might have a little bit of coating on it so that you don't slip when you walk on it. So we have to take into consideration all of our surfaces.
Okay. Could you describe the flow pattern that's shown here in these photographs?
Flow pattern is also considered to be a passive stain, and it is basically where sufficient blood volume is able to drip down. So you see flow patterns with associated patterns that have a larger blood volume, which is usually indicative of further into the particular incident as it's occurring and more bloodshedding is occurring.
Okay, and then the second photograph shows that the stain is kind of moved a little bit. What would cause that?
Oh, that can be caused by the movement of the surface. If I was dripping blood on this counter and I was dripping here and then I moved, that would cause an alteration in flow patterns. Sometimes we also see it maybe on vehicles where you have a flow pattern that comes down and the vehicle may come to an abrupt stop. It'll cause the flow pattern to jerk back and then start to flow down. So that would cause a minor alteration like that.
All right. And can you talk about transfer stains?
Transfer also has its own little branches that branch off of its big branch. And the two are non-comparable transfer or comparable transfer. And non-comparable transfer is just that. There's been a deposition of blood, but I have no idea what that's from. I mean, I do because I made it, but if I was to see this at a scene, I wouldn't know what that was, and I would just call it a non-comparable transfer stain. As opposed to transfer stain up here with what we call ridge detail, which is basically your fingerprints are on the bottom of your feet, the ridges that keep you from, allow you to grasp things. And then this would be a comparable transfer print, and we would call that consistent with the shoe print. or a boot print or some type of footwear because of its distinct delineated lines and evenly separated voids.
All right. Can you talk about large volume stains?
Large volume stains, there are two. Basically, they occur under the same phenomenon, which is where blood source is allowed to flow freely. The difference is one is into an absorbent material, that would be saturation. The other is on a liquid surface that's doesn't have very much porous nature to it. The result is completely non-porous, and then you get a pool of blood.
All right. Can you describe for the jury these photographs reference to spatter?
And welcome back to the Law News Network. I'm your host, Amy Dash, joined by LawNewz trial analyst Deborah Blum. Deborah, we were just listening to this bloodstain expert, and she was talking in some very specific terminology about the different types of stains. Transfer stains, passive stains. There was a lot of blood found from Nicholas Leonard, who was presumed to be the boyfriend of Megan Brown, Adam Matos' ex-girlfriend. And some of it was on the floor. They were saying that that was a passive stain. There was saturation, so maybe it would indicate that perhaps he was killed on the floor. But then there are transfer stains, blood stains found on a chair that's later folded up, also belonging to him. It seems like they're indicating that maybe he was moved after he was killed, possibly to a chair. I mean, why is this relevant?
Well, a lot of times it's going to be relevant, especially when the defense has their turn, because they might say, my client wasn't there but was across the street, so if he shot a gun, it wouldn't have been able to get the person. I mean, that wouldn't apply in this scenario. But there are ways that a defense attorney is going to attack the trajectory of the gun and then the blood splatter. You could say it would have been impossible for where my client was. He was observed by XYZ people, or you see on surveillance videotape that he was in that place. So it's impossible to have killed the people in the manner that the prosecution have detailed to you based upon the trajectory, based upon the blood splatter. But here, I don't really think any of that is overly relevant. I think that her testimony is mainly to show just how grisly of a crime scene this is. And also, you know, it wasn't just like, okay, maybe the person was gruesomely murdered, but now they're trying to say the bodies were also moved, you know, and that's like desecrating a dead person's bodies, maybe.
Yeah, so it's more for the emotional impact, because we saw with the George Zimmerman trial and Trayvon Martin, you had these experts who were really belaboring how everything occurred, because it was extremely relevant there, because you had a self-defense stand your ground law in Florida. And so who threw the first punch and whether it was self-defense or not, I mean, that all came into play there. But here, it just seems like, why are we getting into the nitty-gritty details of how the blood spattered all over the place?
I think that the prosecution, who in general I believe has kept things pretty short and to the point, they want to elaborate on the fact that these people were really tragically killed, and that one was suffocated, one had a gunshot wound to the eye. So they want to get into just how bloody this house was, and they're also going to try to show the deranged nature of Adam Matos, that he lived in this house for a period of days.
Yeah, and so the fact that you've got all of this nitty-gritty testimony, that you said that the defense can really contest it. Was it wise of the prosecution to open this door and get into how things unfolded, when the fact of the matter is we don't really know how things unfolded, and like you're saying, it can all be disputed?
Well, I think they're trying to say it's going to be indisputed. It's not going to be disputed that this is how they actually died. We put on a forensic expert who analyzed their bodies after they were deceased, and they know that the cause of death is XYZ, gunshot wound, asphyxiation. So those facts aren't contested, nor is the fact that this is a gruesome crime scene. So perhaps they're belaboring this a bit too long, but there could be the death penalty phase of this trial if he is convicted.
Yeah, I think that's where it really comes into play, because you've got, I'm looking at the time codes here, I mean, you've got probably close to an hour worth of testimony from this bloodstain expert. And that was going to be my next question to you. Is it because they want to establish the heinous and atrocious nature of this crime, which is an aggravating factor under the death penalty, so that if he's convicted, they can try to get him put to death by the jury?
You know, I'm not in the mind of the prosecution. If I had to guess, I would say yes, that's why they're doing this. They're setting up the case for the death penalty. You know, 4 people are dead here. And if the jury finds Adam Matos responsible, they're going to argue all of these aggravating factors, including the fact that the child was in the home during the time of the death of his mother.
Yeah, absolutely.
And grandparents.
Now, but that wouldn't factor in, would it?
It depends on the
effect
judge's.
on the child.
It could, in my opinion. If I was the prosecution, I would try to argue that to the jury. It might
as a death penalty, as an aggravating factor.
Yes,
the fact that this was witnessed by the and so. But how would you get around the fact that usually the aggravating factors have to impact the victims? For example, with the atrocious and the heinous aggravating factor, you know, that requires that the victims themselves go through a prolonged period of suffering.
Well, you just use it exactly like you were saying. You say that the victim knew that her child was there when she was about to be murdered. You know, there were 4 people dead, so it's not like this was 1, 2, 3. You know, I'm sure that it went very quickly. We're not going to know the exact time frame of it, but it all transpired quickly. But the mother might have been alive while the grandfather was being killed, and she knew that her son was watching this or was in the other room. So that's how the prosecutor would attempt to introduce this at the death penalty phase.
What about the fact that you have 4 people in this house, and if they're obviously not all being killed at the same time? So like you said, not only is the child witnessing it, but they're witnessing the killing of their loved ones. Would that constitute an aggravating factor under the death penalty?
I absolutely think so. You know, New York State is not a state where we have the death penalty. We do have it in federal cases. That applies to New York State because we have federal courthouses here in New York State. And so it is a very interesting question. In Florida, they recently changed the law that has an unanimous verdict by the jury to impose the death penalty.
Right.
So it is a very interesting area of the law. I'm not 100%. I think that unless you 100% know the person is responsible for the death, most likely the jurors will have a hard time imposing the death penalty because there isn't direct evidence necessarily linking him to the killings.
And also, if you want to prove that they witnessed the murders of each other, and that caused some sort of an emotional suffering, you're also going to have these types of experts, right, to show where each person was when they were killed.
Right. So that's probably why they're setting all this up, just to say, you know, we found the bodies in this way, and this was done to the body after the fact. But what's very interesting is that none of the family members were able to call 911. I mean, you know,
when they had in the past, when there was chaos going on
so
earlier that day.
It's very unfortunate that none of them were able to reach out and try to spare their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back now and listen to some testimony from a DNA expert because, as we said, while there is a lot of extensive testimony from this blood spattering expert, the DNA expert says that they couldn't connect Adam Matos' DNA to all these stains that they found in a significant way. And as Deborah said, that will be a large part of the defense's argument in this case.
Yes.
And just so that the record is clear, there were a number of swabs taken from these items. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And what I'd like to do is I'm just going to identify the swabs and at the end ask you whether or not you were able to make a profile with each swab, okay? So I'm going to ask you about swabs from L, swabs from M, swabs from J, swabs from N, swabs from O, swabs from P, swabs from R, swabs from S, swabs from T, swabs from K, and swabs from Q, all coming from SM-137. Those are all individual swabs upon which you tested,
That's correct.
and you were able to develop a profile as it relates to each of those swabs identified.
That's correct.
And what was the result of your analysis as to those swabs?
Those profiles match the profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Okay. I'd like to stay in that same report, 1016 of 15, and move to SM-143, swabs from garage, labeled Z, and in reference to states 371 and 373. Again, it's SM-143.
SM143Z was a complete profile that matched Margaret Brown.
Okay. All right, ma'am. We talked about a swab that was, or a DVD swab that was given to you, or a DVD case labeled as SM83A, correct? And this is that same report.
That's correct.
Okay, I'd like to show you what's been introduced as State's Exhibit 397.
Do I need the gloves for this?
Well,
I recognize the outer package from the FDLE sticker as well as the date and my initials. I also see my own seal that I placed on it back in November of 2015.
Did you remove the items from the bag? Okay. Is that an item that you tested?
Yes, and I recognize it from my initials and the date on the back.
Is there a reference to where you may have taken the swab from?
There's a sticker here.
Okay. Is that an item for which you would have tested?
Yes, I tested it for the chemical indication of blood, and I collected a sample physically from it.
And the sample that you collected from this item, were you able to test it and develop a profile?
Yes, I developed a complete profile that matched the profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Okay. And I'd like to show you one more physical piece of evidence that was been admitted as State's Exhibit 401.
Thank you. I also recognize this from the FDLE sticker as well as my initials and the date, and I see my evidence seals on it.
Okay, could you, and this is an item SM107 represented as being a sock from bag at pin 14.
Yes.
Could you remove the item from that? Okay. All right, and did you take, you mentioned that there were some stains and samples that you collected from that, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in doing so, do you have to actually cut the item of clothing?
Yes, I do.
All right. And you indicated that you tested the stain on that item, is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you able to determine, I guess, a serology as it relates to that item?
From the stain, it was a complete profile that matches the profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Okay. All right, ma'am, still referencing your report of 10/16/2015, I'd like to ask you about a sample that was collected from NS65, identified as plywood from the floor of bedroom A, B1C. This is States 163. 164, forgive me.
Is this NS 64 or 65?
65.
Okay. That's
Okay.
from room A?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Were you able to, that's a little too blurry. Okay. Were you able to develop a profile from the swabbings that was taken from this sample?
A complete profile was obtained, and it matches the DNA profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Were you able to do serology as it relates to this?
Yes, it gave chemical indication for blood.
All right. And I would like also to reference a sample that you may have collected or analyzed from JM32, referencing states 180 and 181.
JM32, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Were you able to develop a profile related to JM32?
A complete profile was obtained that matches the profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Okay. All right, ma'am. I'd now like to ask you some questions about a different room, but still referencing your report as of October the 16th, 2015. Reference to states 264, swabs from MC14 being identified from swabs from floor of room G.
MC14?
MC14.
This profile had a mixture of at least 2 individuals. A major profile could be obtained, and that profile matches the profile from Megan Brown. The additional contributor or contributors is too low level to interpret.
I'd now like to reference a sample that you tested from JM40, being identified as swabs from MBRA, reference states 202, 203. Ma'am, were you able to test this sample?
The profile was a mixture of at least 2 individuals. There was a major contributor. That major contributor matches the DNA profile from Megan Brown. The additional contributor or contributors was too low level to interpret.
Were you provided a sample from JM41, represented as swabs from MBRE, reference to states 198, 199. Were you able to develop a profile related to the swabs from this stain?
This was a complete profile that matched the profile from Megan Brown.
Again, were you provided a sample from JM42, identified as swabs from MBRF, reference to states 200 and 201?
This was a complete DNA profile that matched the profile from Megan Brown.
Were you also provided a swab from JM43, identified as swabs from MBCA, reference states 205, 206?
Yes, this was a complete DNA profile that matched the DNA profile from Nicholas Leonard.
Okay. Were you also provided either the actual item of NS64, identified as plywood from closet of room G, reference states 215?
Yes, I received the plywood itself and collected a sample from this exhibit to do DNA on it. The complete DNA profile obtained matches Greg Brown.
All right, now I'd now like to ask you about a number of items that were submitted to you for the purposes of examination. Did you receive a shovel in this case that was identified as SJG30, and this is in reference to your report 10/21/14? Well, maybe it's, let me double check that date. Yes. page 4 or 5.
Not from the October 16th report.
October 21st, 2014. If I referenced it as October the 21st, 2014, an item was submitted by the identification of SJG30, a shovel.
And welcome back to the Law News Network. I'm your host, Amy Dash, joined by Law News trial analyst Deborah Blum. We were just listening to this DNA expert who basically went through all of the samples that they found and who they belonged to. While we were listening to this testimony, I saw that people in the chat room were saying, hey, what's the difference between spatter and splatter? Because we had previously listened to a bloodstain expert, and she was talking about spatter. And a lot of people thought that was maybe a mispronunciation, but really the difference, because I looked it up, I was interested too. Splatter is, let's say you drive through a puddle and the water splatters all over the place. Different from spatter, which is the actual pattern once those liquids have hit the surface. So what they're doing is analyzing the pattern on the surface to determine how it got there, basically what happened before. And so what would you say is stronger? I know we talked about this at length before. What is stronger, the spatter stains that kind of give us an indication of what went on while the crimes were being committed, or the fact that there's no DNA, peculiarly, there's no DNA residue mixed in with that blood that's all over the place from the defendant?
I do definitely find that to be very, something is missing. Mm-hmm. Why isn't his DNA, why isn't Matos's DNA mixed in with these victims' DNA? It should have come up somewhere. You know, it could come from many different places. We looked into this while on the breaks. It could come from saliva. It could come from a hair specimen. I find it very hard to believe that throughout this entire ordeal that there wasn't some mixing of DNA. It's possible that they had limited They didn't take enough of a sample to actually get a positive DNA identification. I don't think that in what we were just listening to now has been covered. I'm not sure if the defense actually did any cross-examination. This is where I would have really hit the road running. Mm-hmm. You didn't do this, you didn't do that, correct? You didn't
attack the investigation, attack the processing of the crime scene.
Correct.
Yeah, and we were talking before, the fact that he lived in the home with the parents and Megan Brown, obviously her suspected love interest, her new boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard, was also a victim, but he lived with her and her parents there. So if they did find any types of, let's say, hair follicles, that wouldn't be so out of the ordinary to implicate him in a murder because he's around that house. So he's dropping things left and right, perhaps fingernail clippings, follicles of hair, saliva. So how can you really differentiate? Have you seen this problem before where the person who is the suspected killer is somebody who habitates in that home where the crime happens?
I mean, absolutely. That's why so many orders of protection are handed out in New York State, because what if they don't give an order of protection and then a death occurs like it did here? 911 was called, no one was arrested, Matos wasn't arrested earlier in the day. Perhaps that would have spared the lives later in the evening. What I find bizarre, though, is that there was no DNA recovered from the shovel, but perhaps he used gloves, or from the burial scene itself. You know, people spit, they have bodily fluids that they admit,
well, he was sweating, right?
Right.
He was sweating.
Well, he was observed sweating after the fact. So I'm surprised that they didn't recover any DNA, especially where the bodies were buried.
But is there an exclusionary process that these people have to go through when analyzing the crime scene because he lives there? I mean, how can you implicate him in the killing if, like I said, his DNA could be all over the place unless you find it mixed with the blood? And like we said, the fact that there was presumably a gun used to commit the murders, there wasn't a struggle of any type that would lead for there to be blood under the fingernails, or him getting injured so that he would be bleeding and that would be mixed in with the victim's blood.
Well, I'm surprised that they didn't do ballistics testing underneath his fingernails. That's what's done, and I'm not
for gunpowder residue.
Right. So I'm surprised that wasn't done. I don't believe that the time period had elapsed where they could have done that test. I think that it still could have had a positive hit, but it was maybe 5 days, so that could have been too long. I'm not sure how good their technology or their testing is. I assume that it would be state of the art, but you never know.
Yeah, and so let's move away a little bit from the forensic element of this. I'm going to toss really quick to a clip from Megan Brown, one of the victims. Her coworker, Tanya Carlson, was with her leading up to the hours before she was murdered. The accusation is that it was at the hands of her ex-boyfriend, Adam Matos, who lived with her. They co-parented a child together, and the reason why Tanya was so critical here is because she saw the angry text messages from Adam basically allegedly threatening Megan in the hours before her and her parents were killed. And after we toss to this clip, our wonderful host Aaron will be here, and he will take the chair in my place. So thank you so much for having me.